Hello, everybody, and welcome to PHP Dublin September. So we are back after our summer break, and we are happy to be back with an excellent talk today on PHP 8. So before we get into that, I'd like to say the way this is going to go is we are going to have a talk. It's going to go for 50 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A section at the end of it. Good news is that we don't have to wait till the Q&A section to ask your questions. Feel free to ask your questions into the chat, and by we, I mean our speaker, Gabriel, will get to them. And also keep in mind that there is a bit of a delay between asking the question and getting an answer. It's between us seeing it. So it's going to be about 30 seconds before we can address it. So just the nature of distributed systems, we're not ignoring you, don't worry. And yeah, with that, I'd like to introduce Gabriel Caruso. Gabriel, welcome.
Hi everyone, nice to meet everyone. It's my first time at PHP Dublin. My first time at Dublin, and I've never been to Dublin. I just have been to Scotland. But yeah, let's do it. Let me share my screen, start the presentation, and we should be good to go. All right, can you see my screen?
Can indeed.
You're gonna be okay. Cool. Now let's do it. Let's leave it here. There we go. All right, let's start the timer and let's begin. So hello everybody, welcome to PHP Dublin, and also thank you for having me and giving me the space to talk about PHP 8. Yeah, PHP 8 is the new major version of PHP, which is coming to everyone November. A lot of people were thought that we would have the PHP 8 in 2021, we would have in December, this and that, but actually the release is scheduled for the 26th of November, what we call the GA, the General Availability release. But of course, we have run a lot of tests with alphas, betas. We are now in the phase of release candidates. So yeah, we are almost there. After more than 1.5 years of development, we are almost there. One important thing about 2021, PHP 7.2 is not going to be supported anymore. PHP 7.2 is current on security fixes only, and that's going to be gone next year. So PHP 7.3, PHP 7.4 is going to be for support, PHP 7.3 being just for security, PHP 7.4 active support, and of course PHP 8. You can always check it out. I have some links in the bottom of the slides. By the way, these slides are going to be available after the talk, and then you can click to check everything that I'm talking. Everything that I'm talking is public. It's not just something that I know or someone else know. Is just public. Cool. Who am I? I'm someone all the way from Brazil, across the ocean. I have been living there for 21 years, and then I decided to move to the Netherlands to pursue a new phase of my career. I work for a company called SurveyMonkey. You probably have heard of that with surveys. One of our main products is feedback surveys. So either Google Forms, Typeforms, or SurveyMonkey. But also there's a company behind SurveyMonkey, which is the company that I work for, which is Usabilla, which our main product is feedback. We give the tooling and the tools to help people receive feedback from their clients. We can talk about that later on if you want to. And I have also been contributing to the open source software community for about 2-3 years, maybe more than that. And it's just something that I love to do. It's something that has helped me to grow in my career and everything. The agenda for today, we're going to talk about the performance improvements of PHP 8. Probably you have heard about some of them. We're going to talk about some of the new features of PHP 8. We unfortunately don't have time to talk about everything because PHP 8 is huge, but we're going to talk about some of them. A couple of the changes that might affect your code and in your application. The famous breaking changes. This is something that came with major versions, and this is something that probably you're interested in the most, so you can predict how much work you're gonna have to update to PHP 8. I'm gonna bring some internal changes that was made to PHP 8 that probably you're not gonna see it, you're not gonna use it, but it's gonna affect your code some way or the other. And some behind the scenes of PHP 8 zero development. We have some stuff to talk about that as well. Oh, Brazil, you guys have an awesome president. Yeah, our president is amazing. Not gonna talk about that, but yeah, Oh my God, it's a great t-shirt. Oh, thank you. Performance improvements. Let's start on that. So PHP 8 finally brought what we have been waiting for a long time in PHP, which is a just-in-time compiler. The JIT of PHP 8 is based on the Lua language implementation. And two main points that I want to bring about JIT is one, if you have migrated an application from PHP 5.6 to PHP 7, you probably remember that you have massive performance improvements for a number of reasons. That's not going to happen just with JIT, because JIT is focused on heavy processes. So for example, heavy calculations, computer data mining, and everything else that people not even consider PHP. With PHP 8, that might be the case. As I said, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about everything. Oh, there's an internal contributor here of PHP 8, George. We're going to talk about George in the end. So back to the slides. I unfortunately don't have time to talk about JIT because it's a very complex subject. But I want to leave you with 4 links in 4 different languages, in French, Portuguese, English, and Russian. Russian being Dmitry, which was the internal developer that create, develop, and implement JIT, and of course going to be supporting it. And then you can check it out later on in the slides that I'm going to share with you, so you can have a whole talk understanding how you compile PHP with JIT, how you enable it, how do you use it, how do you benchmark. This is another important thing. A lot of people are asking for benchmarks, like how do we benchmark PHP 8? And it's not that trivial, because when you benchmark JIT applications, you need to remember to either enable or disable JIT, and you need to tell that in the benchmark descriptions so people can know when it was benchmarked. But later on, if you have questions about JIT already, I'm willing to answer them. Cool. AWS. AWS is a company that probably a lot of you know about it. If you're not familiar, it stands for Amazon Web Services, which a lot of people, a lot of companies are running their services on AWS. And AWS is helping PHP to become a better and faster and more important language. So there's a blog post, again, you can check it out after with the slides, where they have described that they are doing experimentations with a very specific architecture, which is the ARM64 architecture. And they are finding gaps and finding performance improvements, which they are patching back to PHP. So there's a series of pull requests that has been proposed to PHP since PHP 7.4. So PHP 7.4, PHP 8. AWS is helping PHP to become a faster language in a very specific architecture. But that's amazing, because that shows that even AWS is considering PHP for something, and they are also helping PHP to grow, not just using PHP and so on. So this is an amazing find that I found somewhere last month, a couple of months ago, and then I decided to put in these slides, because that shows that we have big companies behind PHP. And those are the 2 biggest performance improvements that we have. And now we're gonna jump into the features of PHP. PHP 8 has a lot of features. As I said, I don't have time to talk about everything, but as you can see, PHP 8 is going to be huge. There's a lot of new stuff, there's a lot of new functions, there's a lot of new functionalities, there are even new APIs and so on. But unfortunately, we need to focus in some of them to talk about. And I'm going to focus on 5 of them, starting with unit types. Unit types is something that probably you are familiar from the documentation of your code. So for example, here on line 5, line 8, and line 14, we have documentation about unit types, right? So for example, we have properties, we have parameters, we have return types, which say that this thing is either an integer, either a float. But documentation does not ensure types, right? If you try to use this thing as a string and you call both of the methods, that thing is going to work, because there's no type enforcement by the engine and by your script, because PHP does not support unit types. It used to support scalar types, but now PHP 8 is going to support unit types. One of the things that you could do before PHP 8, you could check for your inputs. So either if this thing is an integer, if this thing is a float, you could check it out. But this is very hard to maintain. And now with PHP 8, we're gonna have native support for union types. So in this example, we have just converted all the documentation that we had to actual types. So now the private, so then now the property is gonna be checked, the parameters are gonna be checked, the return types are gonna be checked. Constants are not supported with union types because constant is one type, because I saw some people asking for union types for constants. I was like, okay, there's something going on here in your studies of computer science that I don't know. But constants do not support union types because constants is just one type. And as you can see on this example, if I try to call the method setNumber, which only accepts an integer or a float, now it's going to throw an error saying that, hey, the number one argument, which is number, is expecting an integer and a float. This is something that we have changed as well. Remember the internal changes that I said? We have redesigned a couple of the error messages that we have, and this is one of the error messages that we have redesigned. George and Mate, they are the ones that have been helping us to shape this message, and this is one of the examples. Now we have not just the argument number that you have problems with, but you also have the name of the argument, which is going to help you with a feature that we're going to talk later on. Union types. You can use as many types as you want. Of course, you can't duplicate a type. So if you type the type twice, it's going to show you an error. But you can have as many types as you want. But PHP is also going to have a very interesting type, a very controversial type as well, which is mixed. Mixed is going to be supported on PHP 8. Some people hate it, some people love it, some people have no idea why the hell you would use mixed if you accept everything. And my argument and my opinion on this is mixed is going to be a path. So first you migrate to mixed, then you figured out, okay, I don't need all the types. I can have just 4 types, 3 types, 2 types, and then you start to nail down your types and make your classes better and more typed. But yeah, if you are familiar with JavaScript, you remember any. Mixed works the same way. And this is another addition for the typing system of PHP 8. Another great feature that we have on PHP 8. Hi from Brazil. Hi Joel, how are you doing? Another great feature that we have from PHP 8 is the match expression. But before we talk about match, I want to talk about switch, which is one of the control structures that we have in PHP that probably lots of you, if not everyone, has used it. And is a very trivial and very fundamental control structure that we have. But in PHP, it has some flaws. The first flaw that you can check is the value that we are switching, that we are testing, is a true string. And then on line 12, the case that matches that value is an integer. And then you're like, okay, they are equal, because if you use the double equal of PHP, that's true. But if you use the triple equal, which is the identical operator, that's false. But switch by under the, let's say under the hood, the mechanism of switch compares everything using the 2 equal signs. So this is the first flaw. But the third flaw, which scares me the most, is this: if you don't have a case and you don't have a default in your switch, with this, which is the problem with your script in this case, PHP is not going to tell you that. It's just going to tell you, hey, I'm trying to echoing a variable on the line 17, which is called result, and I don't have that variable. But the problem is not that you don't have that variable. The problem is that you don't have a default for your switch, or you don't have a case for your switch. Of course, you could fix it saying that, hey, if there is no 0, 1, and 2, I want to throw an exception. But PHP could tell you, like, hey, maybe you're missing a switch, or maybe you're missing a case, or you should have a default or something else. And this is when match came to play. Match is an expression, yes, but it's also a control structure, and we're going to talk about the difference in a minute. So the first thing that match fixes is it uses the identical operator under the hood instead of the equal. So in this example, we have 2 as value and we have 2 as case. So they need to be identical. We are not going to judge the types. We're not going to do the trick things that PHP does every single time. as I said, match is not just a control structure, but it's also an expression. So you can use match to echo stuff. So instead of so if you go back to the switch example, we need to store the result in a variable, and then we echo out the variable. In PHP 8 and with match, we can just echoing out the match itself, which is gonna just call out the results. There's a question, not saying everyone uses, but would PHP stun catching? Yeah, PHP stun in this case would catch that you're missing either a default or you're missing something. So PHP stun, if you don't know, is a stat analyzer tool. We're gonna talk about stat analyzers too in the end of the talk. But yeah, PHP stun would caught this, Ken. That's a very great call. So moving on, we have match as a statement, but then this is the biggest feature for me for match, and this is something that I want to put, that I want to invest my time working with match. If you have one of the cases missing, PHP is going to tell you in runtime, if I'm not wrong. It's going to evaluate your structure, it's going to evaluate everything that you have inside the match, and it's going to tell you, hey, you're trying to switch or to match the value free, but you don't have the value free in one of your cases. So either you need to have a default or you need to have a case for that. The biggest feature for this is going to reduce a lot of bugs that you probably would have in production, you're going to have in development. So during the development time, you're going to see, okay, there's a case missing from my match, or there's a default missing from my match, or you can use a PHP stun, a stat analyzer tool for that. But PHP 8 now is doing that by default, and I think this is the biggest features for me, and this was one of the biggest features that people ask in the version 2 of this RFC. So RFC, just for those of you that don't know, is the formal process of proposing features to PHP. So you write down an RFC, which is a document, and then you vote, you discuss, you implement and everything. And the match expression was proposed twice in PHP 8. The first one didn't succeed, but then the second one is the one that is implemented, and you can see there's a bunch of features. Hola, Juicy. How are you doing? It's been a while. And this is the match expression of PHP 8. Moving on, for the third feature that I want to talk about tonight is something that we already have on JavaScript, which is the null safe operator, which is a shortcut. Some people say there is a feature. I say that is more a cosmetic change, but again, it's just my opinion. So what does it do? If you take a look at this script, on line 3, we are calling a method called getNeighborhood in an address. But sometimes an address does not have a neighborhood, which is the case that the address that I live today, we don't have a neighborhood here. And then on line 7, we're going to check, do we have the neighborhood and do we have a name for that neighborhood, or is that name different to know? Then we do something with it. But we could short this script. And with the new safe operator, we can do that on PHP 8. If you take a look on line 3 now, we have this new operator, which is going to evaluate everything from left to the right. And if something on the left returns no, it's not going to break your chain of commands. It's just going to evaluate all the expression to no. And then on this case on line 5, you're going to check if name is either no or not. How to specify the default value when using match? There's the default, so about the match that we have talked about, there's the default, the same way that we have on switch. So you have the default, as George typed in the chat. You just have the default and then you type whatever you want. Thanks for the question. So this is the new safe operator. Again, is a very cosmetic change in my opinion, but a lot of people are interested on the new safe operator because of the chain. So if you have a very big chain of commands and a very big chain of ifs checking for nullability or not, you can now just reduce that to one single command, one single line of code, sorry, and then if then evaluates to null or no, there you go, you already have it. So that's another feature. Then we go to my favorite feature of PHP 8. But before we jump into that, I want to just go quickly to this very simple script. On line 3 to line 5, we have an array of items. Not difficult to understand. On line 7, we have a call to the array filter function, which the first argument is an array of items, and the second argument is the closure or the condition which you're gonna filter your values. Again, I think it's very trivial to understand. And then on line 9, if you var dump the integers, you're gonna check that you just have 1 and 2. This is a very simple script to understand, because array filter is a function that you can understand what it, at least 2 arguments are gonna have there. You're gonna have either the array and either the closure. Which one comes first? We never remember. We always need to check the documentation, but we know. But then we have functions that we are not so used to. For example, array fill. In this case, we have array fill 1, 2, 3, PHP. Okay. What the hell does 2 mean? What the hell does 3 mean? What the hell does PHP mean? The result of this script is an array with 3 items, starting with the index 2, where the values are PHP. And then you start to understand by the output, not by the script, but by the output, you start to understand, okay, this is what array fill do. It creates an array where the first argument is their starting key. The second argument is the number of arrays, the number of items on that array, and then you have the third argument, which is the value of every single item. And then you have this thing on PHP 8, which is called named arguments, named parameters. There's also other names for that in other languages. But this is how in PHP 8 we're gonna give the ability of users to not just document their code, but also to use that documentation to understand better what they're doing. So if you take, for example, this script, and now you have all the 3 arguments with the named arguments, you can understand way better what this thing is doing. And it's not just for functions. You have for methods as well. If you have, for example, the method constructor, which is how we construct stuff in PHP, we can now give the person has a name and has an age, and this is way better to imagine that this class is in a class in a library that you don't have access to the source code for some reason. Now that you have the documentation of that class, you just type the name of the arguments, and then it's way easier for you to understand what that line of code is doing. One important thing about named arguments, and one important thing if you didn't know that PHP allows you. PHP allows you to rename the arguments of your implementations of interface. So if you have an interface, in this case person, and then you have an implementation, which is my person, the setName method is being renamed from name to full name, because probably the person that is implementing that interface does not agree with the argument name. But then with PHP 8, which name should we use to call this method? And PHP is going to follow the renaming. So if you rename your interface arguments, PHP 8 named arguments is going to require you to use the renamed one. This is one of the few caveats of this implementation, this feature, sorry. One of the use cases that I see a lot for named arguments is Boolean arguments, which is a discussion as well in the community. If flags, that's how we call it. If flags, Boolean flags are very good for your code or not. We're not going to talk about that. But take, for example, this class where you have 3 arguments, which the first 2 are Booleans, and then the third one is an array or no. In line 14, you have no idea what the hell true, false, and null means if you just get that out of context. But when you have named arguments, is way easier for you to understand. So I have a user, which in this case is an admin, is not active, and there is no business rules or whatever rule that you want to put it for this code, for this class, and it is way easier for you to understand. Split operator will work with named parameters. Yes, it will. If George can give more details, in which sense? Yeah, George is going to be my warrior in the chat, because he has been contributing to PHP a lot in the past year, so he knows a lot about this feature. Moving on. Another thing about named arguments is how does it work? So if you want to reorder the arguments that you have in your call, you can. So for example, we have arguments 1, 2, and 3, but when we call 2, 3, and 1. This is allowed on PHP 8 because PHP is going to guide itself by the arguments numbers, not by the order that we have called them. With optionals, this is a very good feature because now we can just overwrite one or other argument. You don't need to overwrite every single one of them. So in this example, we are just overwriting the argument 2. And then from line 11 to 15, we have two cases that either is going to work or not going to work. You have a list with 3 arguments, and then you have on line 13, you have the argument 3 being called in the end of the list of arguments, and this is allowed. But on line 15, you have the first argument not being called with named arguments. You have the second one being called with named arguments, and then the third one is not being used. This is a problem because once you have started to use named arguments, you need to finish with named arguments. So in this case, to fix this script, we would need to put argument 3 in front of the 8. Is there any question? You mean swap the arguments using name? Yeah, as I said, you can swap. Is not a problem. So on the first example, you can just change the order. It's not going to affect your code because PHP now is going to check for this thing, not for the list itself. And this is named arguments. I think it's a big feature for PHP 8. If you use PHP Storm, you are familiar with it because PHP Storm, by the UI, it has some type hints which are not actual types, but it's just the way that the UI works. Then you have this thing, but now we are going to have that native in the source code. And then the last RFC that I want to talk about, which was one of the RFCs that a lot of you probably have seen some discussions going on Twitter. This RFC was voted 3 or 4 times, if I'm not wrong. And I'm not going to go into details, but it was basically because of the syntax. Instead of discussing the features of the RFC, people were discussing the syntax. But you know, developers, we like to discuss style of our code. But jumping to attributes, what is attributes? Decorators, attributes, annotations. There's a lot of names for this feature in other languages as well. But basically, it's how you add attributes to parts of your code, either a class, either a property, either a function. And in this example, I'm using Doctrine. Doctrine is one of the biggest and most famous ORMs of the community. And this class is an entity which the 2 properties are columns, and the private property ID is the ID of that table, that entity, sorry. And this is done using annotations, which is the technical term for documentation in PHP. But there's a problem because annotations and attributes, they are different things, right? Annotations is for documentation. Attributes is everything that you can add behavior to your code. So in this case, we are adding behavior of entities, but you can add behaviors of deserialization and serialization. You can add behavior of API routes. For example, with Symfony, you can declare all the routes of your controller using annotations. But again, annotations is something, attributes is something else. So on PHP 8, we have break the implementation. So attributes is an implementation by itself nowadays, and then annotations is going to be used just for documentation. So in this example, we have the final and voted syntax, which is going to follow the Rust syntax, if you are familiar with Rust, the language. And as you can see, it's not very different from what we have today, but what is going to... this is a question that I get a lot, like why did this thing was voted and implemented on PHP if we already have that working in userland? And the answer is there's a lot of good arguments for this thing. The first 2 arguments are the ones that I like the most, which is first, there's a lot of libraries, there's a lot of frameworks that have different implementations of annotations, and now this thing is going to be centralized in the source code, which is amazing because now instead of having 3, 4, 5 implementations, we just have one, which is the core one. And also caching and optimization. If you I don't know, maybe you have 3 classes using the same annotation, the same attribute, which is an object that has already been instantiated. You just cache that out and you just reuse it. You don't need to cache, you don't need to instantiate every single time, because the annotations, you don't have control of that. Because just a quick brief how this thing works with annotations nowadays, it parses the annotation. So it receives all the comments, parses, and then trying to figure out what the hell is going on. With attributes is a whole new API, which is the reflection API that is going to take care of it. And this is one of the points that I have for you as well. If you maintain a library, if you maintain a framework, or if you just want to use the annotation, the attributes feature of PHP 8, be aware that PHP source code is not going to automatically convert everything in the source code. There's no conversion going on. All the libraries and all the frameworks, they need to implement the attributes on PHP 8. So there's a whole session in the RFC that you can check it out later, which is going to guide you how to implement this thing. And those were the features of PHP 8. As I said, there's a number of them, but unfortunately I don't have time to talk about all. But in the end, if you want to toss it out questions, I can answer them, no problem at all. Changes on PHP 8. The first one, this is a very simple change in terms of, will the old reflection API for docblock be deprecated? I don't know. I don't think so, because annotations are still being used by a lot of people. So I think we're going to keep with that API drill. So this is the first change of PHP 8. Throw, before PHP 8, it was a statement, and now it's an expression. What does that mean? The way that PHP parses your code into small tokens and how those tokens get combined and make sense for the engine. Now throw is allowed as an expression. This is a very interesting change, because it was one of the changes to the parse of the language, not to the language itself. And so now you can have, for example, an arrow function returning an exception, which previously you couldn't do that. And also, before PHP 8, you would need to have a number of ifs, saying if this thing is null, throw an exception. Now you can just check, is this thing null, with the null coalesce operator? If it is, there you go. You just throw an exception. So this is a very simple change to the parser of the language, but it's going to allow you to remove so much code that previously you would need to do a lot of stuff to make it happen. Yeah, people are talking about the annotation. Another small change, but a lot of people have asked, is that variable that sometimes you have in your catch of exceptions that you don't use, because you have domain exceptions, which in this case is calling a method outside of this thing, and you don't use the exception because the exception is being caught by your error handling system, which is going to show up in a dashboard. You don't need to have this thing here, but now in PHP 8 that variable is optional, so you don't need to declare it anymore, which is a very simple one, but again, a lot of people ask for that. This one is another thing that the community has asked a lot, which is supporting the magical constant class in objects. So the magical constant class returns the class name with the namespace. So in this case, I have a class bus under the namespace foobar, and if I wanna do this before PHP 8, I would need to have the get class function. By a number of reasons, which I don't have the technical details, we couldn't do that before, but now on PHP 8 you can replace all the get classes with just the class magic key constant. This is very good for frameworks, because frameworks, they need to be very generic, so now either if they have the object or not, they just call the class magic key constant, and they can have the full information that they need to just moving on with whatever they need to do. That's why I'm asking. Joel, what is happening with Doctrine is we don't have the people to work in the implementation. I know that because I'm one of the core members of Doctrine. There is no one currently working in the annotations, in the attribute support. So this is why we don't have plans. I know that Symfony has already added support for attributes, but this is one of the things. If you want to help doctoring, for example, to have support to attributes, you can just go there and just toss it out the implementation for this thing. But no, we're not going to remove any of the old APIs. This thing is gonna keep being there for. I don't think we're going to remove, because you need to have documentation, right? So we need to have that in the API, the reflection API. The last change that I want to bring it up is this one. Actually, there's another one, sorry. One of the last ones is a very simple change in terms of code, but a huge change in terms of developer experience. If you work with databases and you work with PHP, you know that PHP is not very good to tell you what the hell is going on with your database. And there's a reason for that. Before PHP 8, the default error mode for PDO, which is the extension that a lot of us use to connect with PHP, to connect with databases, was silencing everything that comes from the database. So if you have a log table, if you have a database that is down, or if you have a very simple SQL syntax error, this was being silenced by the engine. But now on PHP 8, it's going to be throw an exception. If you have any problems in your database, that's going to be brought with an exception, which is going to improve a lot your development experience. Because if you have a SQL problem, you're just going to be told like, hey, you have a SQL syntax problem, and just fix that. In previous cases, like PHP would continue to run the script, and then you'd have the problem like, hey, I'm trying to access this thing, but I don't have that thing, that variable. But in the end, it's not a variable problem, is something else happening in your database. So this was a small change again that folks made it, but I think it's going to improve the development experience a lot. And then the last one that I want to bring today is something that wasn't proposed via an RFC, was just discussed with the internals, which is, some people say that this line 3 is right, some people say that this line 3 is wrong. Because optional arguments shouldn't be followed by recorded arguments. There was a discussion with named arguments, if we could do that with named arguments, but then we have not voted, but we have come to the agreement that it is not right, okay? Because you have record arguments that you need to list in your function or your method, and then you have the optional arguments. So PHP would allow you to do that in the past, but what is going to happen on PHP, you're going to have a deprecated notice, which is going to tell you, hey, parameter 2 is optional, but is required, but is followed by the parameter which is required. Again, it's something that is very controversial, but the decision is done, the decision is made, is implemented, and then on PHP 9, we're going to remove support for this. JSON throw exception. André, I have a feeling that we have changed that on PHP 8 as well. If George is in the chat, you can check it out. I think we have changed it, the way that we throw exceptions with JSON decode and encode as well. I don't remember, but hey, that could be a thing for PHP 8.1 or PHP 9, who knows. Yeah, that's a very, very good one. Have JSON throwing exceptions instead of just throwing a no in your JSON. BC breaks, which is probably why most of you are here. Quick, PHP 7 features that were deprecated are now removed on PHP 8. As I like to say, don't use deprecated stuff because they're going to be removed someday, and the day is here. PHP 7 features that were deprecated are removed. There's a whole list of deprecated features of PHP 7 link on this slide. But I think the biggest one that probably you're going to face is the PHP 7.4 constructors. PHP 4 constructors. So if you have constructors in the PHP 4 style, which is the same name of the class, is the same name of the method, that thing would be considered as a constructor. Now on PHP 8, you need to declare the magic method constructor. So this is one of the changes. This change was made by a Brazilian. I'm not going to tell you who it was because it wasn't me. But there was a Brazilian that decided to change the magic methods of PHP 8. Before PHP 8, you could write stuff like this. You have a toString method returning a Boolean. Why not? This thing makes zero sense. So now on page 8, we are checking all the signatures of magic methods. There's a whole list on this RFC, but now every single magic method we are gonna check if it makes sense to have that return type or not. We are not enforcing types for magic methods. That's a very important one, but we are checking if you're using the right methods with the right types. This is a very simple change that we made it, but it's gonna improve the typing, and it's gonna make a lot of sense what we are typing with our magic methods. Another breaking change, which, as I like to say, if you're doing this with your code, there is something going on. But as Ken has already said in the chat, if you use PHP stun or if you use a stat analyzer tool, this thing would be caught. Which is, if you try to divide an array by another array, previously that would return 0 on PHP. But now on page 8, we are throwing errors saying, hey, you can't divide two arrays. The same way that you can't increment arrays. I know that some people say, no, if I increment an array, I expect all the arguments, all the items on that array to be incremented. That makes no sense for a lot of us. And also classes, we don't have the magic method increment, so it makes zero sense for you to increment your classes. So we are also throwing an error on that. So yeah, that's another change. It's a breaking change, but again, if you have a stack analyzer tool, that thing would be caught by it. You don't need to be aware of that. And then the last breaking change of PHP that I want to talk about is a famous one, which is 0 being equal to a string. Before PHP 8, that would be considered as true. But now we have fixed it. Nikita has gone through a lot of process, a lot of research, a lot of documentation, a lot of stuff to make this happen, and he made it. We're gonna talk about who is Nikita in the end. But now on PHP 8, 0 is no longer equal to full, because they are not equal. Period. Before PHP was considered as equal, but now it's not. And another thing that changed is 0 is not equal anymore to an empty string, and also a number is not equal to a string that contains that number. Previously, this was returning true because we are casting this string internally, and then the full would be drop, and then 42 string is equal to 42 integer. Remember that we have the equal and the identical, which is 3 equals in PHP, but these are the 3 changes to the comparisons between strings and numbers on PHP 8. And those were the breaking changes. There are a lot of other breaking changes, but I don't have, unfortunately, the time to talk about. But there's a whole migration guide that's going to be written for PHP 8 where you can check it out. One of the things that I want to talk is some internal changes that we made, and George is in the chat, and he together with Mate and also some other folks on PHP internal code, they were the ones that helped us doing this change, which is the reflection API. We have talked about the reflection APIs. And the reflection API is one of the most powerful APIs that we have in the source code, which gives you the ability of reflect something, a function, a class, a method, a constant, and give you a lot of information about that. This is very good for stat analyzer tools. This is very good if you're doing some stuff with I don't know, PHP Storm is doing this thing, for example, to give you hints like, hey, you're passing this thing wrong, you're passing this thing right. But before PHP 8, this script, which is getting all the parameters of array filter, is trying to get the type and also the return type. All this information was empty. There was no information at all about types in PHP 7. But then you go, in PHP 7 we had types, right? Yes, but we didn't have, we haven't added that to PHP internal functions. So George, Mate, and a lot of other folks, they have created a forced task to change it more. George, if you have the number in your head, as far as I know, is more than 2,000 functions, right? We have more than 2,000 functions that were changed in their internal code in order to have this feature. So now, if you reflect the array filter function, you're gonna have that the first parameter is an array, the second one is an optional callable, the third one is an integer, and the return type of array filter is an array. Previously, you didn't have this information, and this is very important, as I said, for stat analyzer tools, but also for JetBrains. So PHP Storm has its own package implementation, I don't know, about functions, just to let you know if you're using this wrong or right. But now probably this thing is going to be deprecated because we have this thing built in the source code nowadays. And also some more internal changes that we made. The error reporting now is considered all, so all the errors, including notice and deprecations that were removed. This thing is going to improve a lot your development experience. And also, if you use assertions in your code, which is you just assert, there's a function in PHP called assert, and then you are asserting that that class is an instance of that class, if that argument is a string or not. Previously was just raising a warning and let you continue with the code. But the same way that C works, we are now throwing an exception. So if you have a problem, you just throw an exception. And then the third one is a very small one configuration that we have add, which is the trace of an exception previously was limited to 25 characters. So if you try to get all the trace of an exception, that would be limited to 25 characters. But now in PHP 8, you're gonna have the whole phrase of an exception, which is very good for error handling libraries to work with it. Way too many props for Nikita by allowing us to make. So Nikita, not just union types, but also the types errors raising RFC, which change a lot of the errors from warnings to exceptions. That help us to remove a lot of the falses that we have in PHP. So for example, a string function previously was returning a string and or false, but now it's just going to return a string, and this is the way that we could add types to the source code. Yeah, Nikita made that possible as well. True. Behind the scenes of PHP 8, we are almost there, almost finishing. I want to talk to you about some stuff that happened in the behind the scenes, and the one that I want to talk about is who is behind PHP 8, who were the people that made PHP 8 possible. The first two is Sarah and I. We are the official release managers of PHP 8. Sarah has already been the release manager of PHP 7.2, and she's helping me be the release manager of PHP 8. And what is our role as release managers? Is basically packing, compiling, and distributing everything that people have developed in the source code and make that available for the community. So the tarballs, which we call, we pack, we compile, we send that to Red Hat and to Microsoft so they can run the quality assurance tools to make sure that this thing is compatible with all the Linux and Unix implementations, and also Microsoft if this thing is compatible with the Windows builds. But also we are the ones that is sharing the knowledge with everyone. So for example, me coming to meetups, and meetups give me the space to talk about PHP 8. This is another thing that we do as release managers. And then we do a bunch of other stuff as coordinating releases, making sure that people are not breaking APIs after a certain point. There's a whole documentation and a whole process of how I got voted, because this was an election between 4 people, and Sarah and I, we were the ones that get it voted for the release manager of PHP 8. And also the contributors of PHP 8, who made PHP 8 possible. So Dimitri, he was the one that implemented the just-in-time compiler. This Russian is a beast. This guy knows stuff that I probably will never understand. And also Nikita, which is another Russian, which is living in Germany right now, if I'm not wrong. He was hired by JetBrains to work full time in his projects and also in the PHP source code. And he's responsible for more than 10 API, 10 RFCs of PHP 8. So he is a huge contributor of PHP 8. We also have Christopher, which is working on behalf of Microsoft. So the Windows compatibility layer, he's the one together with Anatol. We also have Jacob, which is maintaining the FPM in PHP, which is one of the subs that we have. We also have Matteo, which is the organizer of PHP Day in Italy, but we also have him helping us with the PayDO and also the Postgres extensions. We have Tyson. Tyson is a contributor and I think one of the founders of Fun, which is one of the alternatives to PHP Stan, and he brought a lot of stuff that they caught with Fun. He brought that to the source code with contributions, with RFCs, which was amazing additions. We have George, which is in the chat, and we also have Mate, which they are both new contributors to the PHP 8, and they made a lot of stuff. George, I think George has also some RFCs merging the PHP 8. So kudos to these two boys, because without them, we wouldn't have PHP 8 and a lot of features that we have. We also have two new contributors. Alex is from Zambia. He's the first African contributor of PHP 8. I was so happy to see that, because I think I never saw an African contributor. And we also have Eliha. Eliha was responsible for the arrow function. No, sorry. He was responsible for the match expression RFC. He was the one that coded, that designed it, that implemented, and he used to work, or he's working with PHP Stan, the source code of PHP Stan. He's involved with it, and he brought a lot of stuff to the source code as well. So kudos to these two. And we also have Benjamin from Doctrine, which was the guy, one of the guys that implemented the attributes RFC. And also Nicholas. Nicholas works for Symfony. He's a core member of Symfony, and he created an interface for PHP. I didn't have the time to talk about the stringable interface, but he also made a contribution to PHP. So PHP was made by a lot of people. Of course, it's not just everyone that is here. There's a lot of more people that contribute, but these are the highlights that I want to bring, because PHP 8 is an amazing language, not just by all the features, but also how many people brought the features to PHP 8. I was so happy to see it. So to wrap it up, PHP 8 in a few words. This was a version that the community helped us a lot. We have heard a lot of the requests, so union types, just-in-times, match expressions, attributes in the source code. We have heard that and we have implemented, and I was very happy to see this bridge being built between the community, the PHP community, and the PHP internals community. And another question: how easy is going to be to migrate to PHP 8 from a PHP 7 from a PHP 7 version? It's not going to be that difficult actually, because there are not so many break changes that probably a state analyzer tool would cut it. So we have Ken in the chat saying, if I use PHP Stan, all those things that you have told about breaking changes, that thing would be caught by PHP Stan. Yeah, that's true. So if you use a state analyzer tool, it's going to be way easier for you to migrate to PHP 8 as opposed to someone that do not have it. But PHP 8 itself is not difficult at all to be migrated. But of course, if you have problems migrating to PHP 8, it's not that it's easy, but it's not that difficult. And if you want to help PHP 8, there's still time. We are going to release candidates versions next week. And if you're testing PHP 8 and if you find bugs on PHP 8, please report to us, because then we can have the first version of PHP 8, PHP 8.0.0, stable without bugs. Imagine that. That would be a dream. But I need your help to do that. To wrap it up, There are a lot of stuff in this talk, I know, but unfortunately, this is not everything. There's still a bunch of stuff that I haven't talked about. There's a lot of great talks in the community. There's a lot of features that I haven't talked about. There's a lot of changes that I haven't talked about. There's a list with all the contributors of PHP 8. So there's an official document that I made, which we're gonna share with you in the end of the talk, which you can check to see what new stuff that we have. And that's it. Was a long talk. Sorry that I need to rush at some points. One thing that I ask you is to give me feedback because that's the way that I can improve this talk for future presentations. So you can scan this QR code, or you can go to this link, which I'm going to drop in the chat, and give me feedback. But you can also download the slides. So these slides, I made them as a formal of reference for everyone that wants to know about PHP 8. So you can just download the slides and check it out everything. And for that, I ask everyone to make questions if you have. If you haven't, thank you for the space of speaking at PHP Dublin. And I hope I have give you some introduction and some idea of how big PHP 8 is and everything that you're going to have it with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. That was absolutely fantastic. I know in a remote talk, it's hard to gauge feedback. You can't hear the audience clapping. But let's just say we've got a lot of engagement on the video right now. I mean, if you could see the stats I'm looking at, it's pretty solid.
Nice, nice.
Yeah, so I think now we're going to kick off the Q&A section, if that's all right. And I'm going to kick off with some, thanks for that, questions of my own. Start off with that. Cool. So first question I have is around unions. So the union type. So the idea is that you're able to now put into the type system something that we've always just used annotations to give that information. So that's very useful for when you want to actually make sure that the system is returning what you say it's returning.
Yep.
So one of the things, use cases I've been thinking about for that would be the command pattern or command handler pattern. So the idea is that you either have success, which returns a defined structure of data, or it returns a failure with a different defined structure of data. So anything where it is definitely going to be either a pass or a failure, and you don't want to ask, you don't want to return a generic object and then ask questions about it. It makes more sense to do something, I think, that has it can return both types. So I'm just wondering, would there be any gotchas, do you think, with the union operator, or would there be other use cases?
The use case that you just gave us is one of the examples of many examples of union types. But one thing that you said, and I'm gonna use that again, is we have been using union types as annotations for a long time. We just documented like, hey, either this thing is 2 types, 3 types, either this thing is an intersect type. This is another kind of types that we have, not just union types, but for example, intersect types. So you have one of the easiest examples that I can remember is with mocking in your test, because either you need to have the mock object and also the class. That is not a union type, that's an intersect type. And this is very important for the engine to know if we have both types at the same time. We don't have intersect types on PHP 8, but with union types, now we're gonna make sure that we have those 2 types there. So this is one of the cases that I can tell you that is going to help us a lot, because now we're going to reduce and bind just for those 2 types. And if something else get into that mock object, we're going to say, hey, there's a 3rd class here that makes 0 sense to be here. And now we can validate that. I think that's the point as well.
That's a great point, and I completely agree with that. It's something that I frequently have to fool the system via annotations that, you're getting an instance of this class, wink, just so that it, just so that the IDE isn't screaming at me that something is going wrong. And that's definitely a great use case, because it allows you to, pass things around that, pretend it's actually an instance, but it's also returning this type as well, expected it. Great idea, and I will definitely be using that. So we actually have some questions here from people as well. So Joel asks, he'd like to ask about the performance improvements. So he says that there isn't this huge difference between 5.627. But which points can you see the performance improvements? So you kind of
Uh,
you kind of mentioned
Yeah,
previously about
I have mentioned. So, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the JIT compiler is for have processes. So, for example, if you're doing Bitcoin with PHP, if you're doing machine learning with PHP, if you're doing a photo processing with PHP, if you're doing that, you know that it's very complicated to do that with PHP. It's so heavy, it's so bad, it's so slow. With the JIT compiler, we're gonna have some massive performance improvement because that's the focus of the JIT. But JIT does not come just for people that have been using PHP, but people that wants to use PHP for those things. So let's say that they want to use for machine learning. This is a very complicated calculation process that happened that PHP couldn't handle because it was so heavy that either would take some times or either would fail by the amount of connections or by the amount of memory that you use. With JIT, you can have that. So PHP 8 is going to be, as I said in the title, is a new era for PHP because now PHP is going to be considered for this kind of stuff that wouldn't be considered in the past. And as I said in the beginning of the presentation, your APIs, let's say that you have an API that is returning stuff in 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 milliseconds. Those APIs are fucking fast already. Sorry for the word, but it's already very fast. JIT is not focused on that because that's fast. 100 milliseconds is very fast. Imagine, for example, that you have a machine learning process calculations that takes hours with PHP. That would be dropped to minutes or maybe 10, 12 minutes. So this is why also I don't provide benchmarks for the presentation because benchmarking JIT is going to be very difficult because you need to have benchmarks with JIT, without JIT, JIT with different implementations, JIT with different configurations. This is something that the 4 talks that I have linked, they mention about. JIT is a very configurable in PHP. You have 4 numbers, which those 4 numbers have 4 numbers of permutation, which gives a lot of options for you to configure. So you're gonna have to play with everything to figure it out. Okay, this is how this thing is gonna give me performance improvements. So that's why I don't provide benchmarks, but I think the have process of that either use or do not use PHP, they're gonna start to use, and then they're gonna see performance improvements on that.
Makes sense to me. It sounds like it's entirely context specific.
Yep. One of the things that Dimitri told in the RFC was what I said. A lot of people were asking PHP to be considered for those kind of stuff. So, for example, machine learning. So they want to use PHP for whatever reason, but they can't because it's not fast enough. Because there is a have process. And now with JIT, they're going to be able to consider PHP for doing those kinds of stuff.
Makes sense. So I think that also addresses Rod's question here about since it's used primarily as a web platform, why is there GAT?
So that's the thing. PHP is not web focused. PHP is not focused on web for a long time already. People say that PHP is web focused. PHP is being used for a lot of stuff. I have seen people doing stuff with PHP that I couldn't believe. But the JIT is focused not for the web. It's focused, as we said, for the have process that happen either offline or happen in data centers, databases that takes hours to be processed. This is where PHP is going to be maybe considered to be used with the JIT implementation of PHP 8.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Cool.
I think George has given some other speed improvements here about how the op cache will be faster because of union types.
Oh yeah, that's a benchmark that I saw somewhere. Yeah, what we have understood so far is by removing some features of PHP 7 that were deprecated, that is affecting performance improvements. I didn't understand how or why. If George has something to comment on, but yeah, we have seen that there already. A lot of people are using the betas and the alphas, even on production. I saw some tweets on Twitter about people using the alphas and betas of PHP 8 on production and reporting, hey, we have massive performance improvements because of this or because of that. So yeah, that's also another performance improvement.
Well, actually, we've got a good one. Ken here has got a guess about parsing large XML or JSON files.
Totally.
Probably,
Probably.
given, especially if you're doing a lot of processing of the data
Yeah.
that's in it.
For
Um,
example, one of the things that I don't know if it's going to be affected, but if you have long-running CLI commands that is parsing data, if it's connecting to databases, if it's doing math calculations, if it's, I don't know, receiving a stream of data from Kafka, those processes are going to be the processes that we are going to benchmark the biggest performance improvements. But that we need to have the data from the community saying, hey, I
yeah.
have this process that do this thing was taking hours, now it's taking minutes. This is the kind of benchmarks that we're going to see, but probably it's going to be just post GA in November that we're going to start to receive those feedbacks from the community.
Well, that definitely makes sense. Well, I've got a few more questions, but I don't think I think we've running sort of out of time here, given we're already a
I
little bit
have
over.
nothing to do tonight. If you want to
Oh,
ask those
oh, okay.
questions, I have no problem.
Okay. Well, so one of the thoughts, just reading about, so named arguments, there was
Hmm.
that was one of the more controversial RFCs, if I remember correctly, and there were lots of
Yeah.
people bringing up like solid principles, like the Liskov substitution principle and things like that. But
Hmm.
from what I could see about it, most of the arguments people were making were about if you're designing things in strange ways, like it'll break if you're already doing silly things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Go ahead. Finish the
oh no,
question.
no, it's just like for example, there's some people like you brought up like say a design thing already, which is booleans. So if
Hmm.
you're passing in booleans to change the internal behavior of a function, um, it's not that named arguments are encouraging you to do this. They're
Yeah.
just giving you an intermediary step to bring more clarity to the code.
Yeah, yeah. So another argument that I saw was about renaming. So if you have not about renaming, sorry, but the names of your arguments are now going to be part of your API because PHP does not allow renaming. This is one of the concepts that we didn't brought, Nikita didn't brought from Python, if I'm not wrong, that you can rename some stuff. That's not going to be allowed. But again, I agree that your APIs and your arguments of your APIs are part of the API. Some people say that APIs and arguments are different stuff. I have the opinion that arguments should be part of your API, talking about class, methods, functions. That's the kind of API that I'm talking about. So named arguments are gonna highlight that. One of the things that, for example, the PHP 8 named arguments highlighted is how bad named parameters we have in the source code. So we have a bunch of internal functions that had so many bad naming arguments that we have started a force task, again,
Mhm.
another force task that we made on PHP 8 to rename. So a lot of the string functions, a lot of the array functions, XML extensions, database extensions, we have been renaming all those stuff to make clearly for people to use. And as you said, Boolean flags, renaming of interfaces, abstractions, a lot of other stuff. Those silly or bad design stuff are going to be just exposed even more with naming arguments. It's not just naming arguments is bad, it's just that it's exposing those kinds of things that we had in the past that people were doing not wrong, but we're doing the way that they thought was right or thought was a good design. But now PHP 8 is highlighting, hey, you have this class that is receiving 5 Boolean arguments. Like, why the hell are you doing that? That you need five? Like the amount of permutations that you have with 5 Boolean arguments is already huge. Like, and a lot of people defend that this is a very good pattern for creating class. I disagree because, for example, instead of having an user with a boolean saying, "Hey, this user is an admin or not," why the hell don't you have an interface and then you have two implementations? An admin user implement the interface and a normal user implementing that interface. This is way cleaner, and you don't have the boolean arguments. But again, this is a design of choice. The naming arguments RFC didn't touch on that. It was touching more on the fundamentals of the language.
Well, like one of the good examples, good use cases was given earlier was what happens if you have default values for variables.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
um,
that was one of the arguments and one of the reasons that a lot of people voted for the RFC
mm,
is I have 5 arguments that are optional. Maybe it's a string, maybe it's something. Previously on PHP 7.4 and below, you need to have, let's say that I want to change the third argument. I want to change the string. You need to provide the first, you need to provide the second, and then you provide the third, changing that value. Now you just change the third argument by calling the name, And there you go. This is
Mhm.
this is one of the biggest use case that I can imagine as well.
Well, I could see, well, for myself anyway, in the code that I'm working with, because one of the things about this is that a lot of the problems people are bringing up, design problems with this, these features are added because PHP is also a long-lived language. Yes, it's not great that you have
Right.
methods with 5 and 8. Yes, ideally, in an ideal world, they shouldn't exist.
Yep.
But the reality of the situation, they do exist, so we have to deal with them. And so the
Hmm.
language, if it can make it easier for people to deal with it and then make it easy for them to migrate away from it, all the better.
Yep.
So, for example, I frequently create objects that, say, the constructor would have four values, like four values that are basically have smart defaults for them.
Dependency
Um,
injection, right?
yeah, dependency injection,
Okay.
exactly. Um, and then when I'm writing the tests, I'm constantly creating these, big objects, but sometimes I'm just like, okay, just use defaults for everything but this argument. That's the only one I actually care about in this test case.
And there you go.
There
With
we go.
name
Just
arguments, you're gonna be able to make that way easier, way
well, not
easier
just
for you.
way easier, but also way cleaner to read. That's what
Yeah.
it'll make the code easier to understand,
Yeah,
which is
my personal goal is to see how easier it's going to be to read code with PHP with name arguments. One of the things that this implementation didn't brought from Swift, which is the iOS language, is they go even further. The API is one name, and the internal scope of the functions is another name. So let's say that you have a class which is, let's say you have a method which is receiving a string. Your external name is going to be something that makes sense for the business logic. Let's say the name of the user. But internally, it's just a string. Let's give you a silly example, but it's just a string. So Swift allows you to rename outside of inside the scope. This is something that PHP does not need it or does not want to. But name arguments is something that is being out, as you said, in a lot of languages, but PHP didn't have it so far. But now we brought it on PHP 8. One thing that you said that I completely agree is PHP is being out for a long time, and in the beginning that was not the focus of PHP. Some people ask like why you would have that with web applications. That's because PHP is swifting from a web environment to more business stuff, to more enterprise stuff. I was having a chat with a Brazilian company yesterday exactly about that. For example, a Brazilian company wants to have the ability of control how many processes and how many pools it opens with a database. We wouldn't need that in the past with PHP because you just open a connection, you just receive data and then you close
mhm.
it. But let's say that you need to have a stream of data for some reason with a database. You need to have control with the amount of connections that you pursue with that database. And PHP does not allow you to do that. But this is stuff that is going to start to come up when more and more companies start to adopt PHP as its official language. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Well, I definitely think from what we can see, PHP is not going anywhere in the near future and is only going to keep growing.
Yeah,
Which,
yep. 25 years is just the beginning.
well, that's great to hear from one of the release managers. Anyway, I think uh, I don't think anybody in the chat would be worried, but it's always nice to have it confirmed.
Yeah, it also at least PHP 8 I need to keep releasing PHP for 3 years. That's the release process that I have agreed upon. So at least for 3 years we have PHP 8. If we're gonna have PHP 1, if we're gonna have PHP 9, that's some other stuff that I have no idea if we're gonna have in the future.
Well, that's
But another thing that I want to add to the talk that I didn't have the time was a lot of the features that we have in PHP 8, they were huge. For example, unit types, that's a huge change. JIT types, JIT implementation, that's a huge change. And now that we have these massive big changes of PHP 8, we can now jump to to bigger problems. For example, generics. A lot of people are asking generics for PHP because they want to have control of their arrays or stuff. But that is even bigger than unit type. So now we have even more time to develop. Now we need more time to implement, and now we need more time to research. But now that we have shipped a version of PHP with a lot of great features already, now we have more time to develop these bigger and bigger features. For example, async. A lot of people want PHP to be asynchronous for some use cases. That's another bigger change that we need to study, research, see the use cases, and that's going to take a long time to develop. But yeah, it's coming. Like I see a future of PHP with those kinds of features, but yeah, takes time because those big features is not trivial. It's not someone that is going to implement. It's going to be probably a team from a company that is going to bring a patch saying, "Hey, we have implemented this async concept. We have tested. We have running, and we just want to implement it." This is when I want to see the future. More companies, for example, AWS helping PHP to grow. This is the future that I want for PHP.
Well, and yeah, I think everyone would love to see the language continue to grow, and it looks like that companies get involved in the growth of the
Yep.
language is already beginning. So long may it continue.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, well, I think
Something else.
that's every question that we have, and so I think this is probably a good time, a good spot to end the Q&A and the talk on.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say, Gabriel, thank you so much for giving that talk. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you for
Um,
this space as well.
absolute pleasure. Like to thank everyone that attended and was engaged in the chat. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for your excellent questions, and thank you for uh, George and various other people from the PHP development team who are in giving answers to questions and giving us more information. That
Yeah,
is
that helped me a lot because I was trying to focus on the chat, but then when I saw George, I was like, okay, George is gonna answer all the
yeah, he's got
questions
it
because
covered. He's got it
he's
covered.
more because George, he's one of that is developing PHP. I have made one or two contributions, but most of my times is focused on the releasing process. So having George on the chat was just amazing. So I just like, okay, he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, it's in safe hands. It's in safe hands.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Well, just to say before we finish up, we are going to share the link to the slides in the YouTube chat, and it should be a comment. We're going to share it on Twitter and just share it in various other spaces. Um, and you also have that Google Doc, which has
Yep.
complementary, supplementary information. So
Yeah,
if you
I'm
could
gonna share that as well.
share that with me, and I'll distribute that as well.
Cool.
And yeah, just from everyone at PHP Dublin, thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Bye bye,
Okay,
people. Thank you.
excellent to see you, everyone. And the stream is ended.
There we
There
go.
we go. We can talk frankly
Woo!
now.